Before I start, I would like to thank Rosa Laura and Michele and Danilo and Giuseppe for once again allowing me to participate in this wonderful IPROMO course. And I hope all your participants will get an opportunity to actually experience the course in real field conditions, because our Italian friends have tremendous experience, historic experience on the mountains which are the most developed mountains in the world. And they have so many interesting stories to tell you on what to do and what not to do. So I hope in the future you might actually be able to participate. So you have my introduction. What I'd like to do this morning is give you a bit of an introduction, mostly focused on water-related issues in the mountains. So this morning we'll talk first of all about how to do integrated watershed management. Then we take a break and talk about extreme climatic events. Then we look at the case study of the Colorado River. And then I'll talk a little bit about hydropower and electricity. Tomorrow, I will bombard you more with thousands of graphs and pictures to talk about mountain tourism, but my part of the mountain tourism is strictly related to water use. And then we'll talk a little bit about water contamination. And then you're all depressed because I'm giving you all the bad news about what is happening. So I want to finish with some positive things to show you what we can actually do in terms of mitigating stormwater and flooding. And I want to show you what you and all the citizens can actually do to rehabilitate water resources. So that's the program for the next 2 days. Before I start, I would like to let you know what happened 1 week ago where I live in British Columbia. If you think of Canada, you think of igloos and ice hockey and snow. Well, last week we had the most unusual climatic event ever in the history of our part of the world. And my province is 90% mountains. So what happened was we call a heat dome. All of a sudden, the atmosphere was completely stationary and it started heating up in an incredibly fast way. So we are located here on the Pacific coast. This is all mountainous environment. These are the record temperatures which occurred last week. Now, just to put this in perspective, 200 kilometers from where I live, we got 49.6 degrees temperature records. This is the highest temperature we have ever recorded in Canada. Just to put this into perspective, the highest temperature we ever recorded globally is in Death Valley in the desert between California and Nevada. That was 54.4 degrees last year. So that gives you a bit of an idea. These temperatures are temperatures which you experience in Abu Dhabi, maybe in Pakistan, in Karachi, or places like that. So when you think of Canada, you think of snow and ice. We got this incredible situation of a climate event, which now the experts are saying we never even considered that in our modeling. And this is a wake-up call for all of us, because this is not just getting heat. Let me show you what has happened in the short term. So we got this heat dome, then we got over 25,000 lightning strikes, and then the fire started, and the town where we had the highest record is completely destroyed by wildfire. And we now have over 200 different wildfires in the forest, because most of our province is forested. And in addition to that, a number of rivers actually flooded because the snow melted so fast. And then the milk production by the cows dropped by about 20%. The intensive chicken operations lost about 5% of all their chickens from heat exhaust. The latest record is that probably 500 people died of heat exhaustion because nobody around here has air conditioning except the liquor stores. And BC Hydro, which is the company, the government company who produces our electricity, produced the highest amount of electricity ever in the history of our province. Now think of this in a different way. This is happening in June. That's the beginning of our summer. Now think of if this would happen in August, and it would happen maybe for a month's period. We are 95%, our electricity is 95% hydropower. And so if this would right now, the rivers are fairly high. They're probably just peaked a couple of weeks ago. All the reservoirs are full, so we had no power and no problem producing all the hydroelectricity. If this would happen in August, when the reservoirs are down and the rivers are down, we're talking about a totally different situation. The other thing you need to remember is in 2017 and 2018, we had the greatest wildfire seasons ever, and that produced more CO2 than all the CO2 from emissions from our activity in the province. If this next week continues to burn, we probably produce more CO2, and this is never accounted for in the accounting for emissions. So this is clearly a wake-up call for all of us, because we need to act in a much more rapid way to address the climate change. And I would argue you all survived, hopefully, from the virus, and now we have a vaccine. So hopefully that will help us through this crisis. However, there is no vaccine for climate change. We need hundreds of different types of vaccine actions to cope with this type of situation. So it's fairly urgent, and I'm getting a bit impatient in my old age because we haven't really moved fast enough to address what is happening in the climate. So that's just as a quick introduction, just to show you the difference. I live at sea level, and I'm showing the climate stations at sea level. So we were at about 33, 34 degrees in the city. These are the cities 200 kilometers away. The numbers are the differences in temperatures. We thought we were very hot with 34 degrees. Well, these communities were between 15 and 20 degrees higher than we were here in Vancouver. Extraordinary. So let's go to the introduction of integrated watershed management. So you know all about the mountains and how many people live there. You know where all the mountains are, and you know the advantages. The mountains are the water towers. They're a hotspot of biodiversity, a paradise for recreation, a spiritual environment. But there are all kinds of constraints in mountains. They're very fragile, they're very hazardous, they have very low resilience to changes. What happens in mountains can have a very large impact long distance downstream. And mountain areas have low productivity capacity, and transporting in and out of the mountains is difficult. So many conflicts originate in mountains and poverty issues, and hopefully we can address some of these and give you some suggestion on what to do. So traditionally, we have been managing water, and the traditional approach, in my view, is no longer appropriate. So the traditional approach has been top-down, governments decide what to do, and there's very little enforcement on issues like water. There is very little monitoring. We have lost many of our monitoring stations for climate and for discharge because governments were trying to save money. And until very recently, there's been very little stakeholder involvement. So the water agencies pay little or insufficient attention not only to climate, but also to land use activities. Many different government agencies and resource areas manage water and the water quality, but have very much overlapping jurisdictions. And I will show you that in a moment. So why do we need a new approach? Well, I think the public has lost a bit of confidence in the traditional approach because there are lots of contradicting and overlapping jurisdictions. There's a lack of integration between agencies. If you look at how we manage cities, the people who treat your wastewater and the people who treat your drinking water often never talk to each other. Yes, they have to deal with different problems, but still they're doing treatment, so they can benefit if they start collaborating. There's a lack of ability to make sound management decisions. The costs and the time for decision making is very long. Institutions have their own agenda. Emphasis is usually on cleaning up at the end of the pipe, meaning once you have things polluted, we need to clean it up. Well, we need to start controlling what we are putting in before we treat the whole thing. And there is a real failure of adequately monitoring. So there's a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of fragmentation, and we usually do crisis management. We don't do anything until we have a flood or a drought or something like that, and then often we don't make the right decisions. So the problem with water governments is that different agencies, this is happening in Canada, but it's happening elsewhere as well, that these are all the institutions which deal with water. These are the institutions which do the monitoring, and these are the institutions who are responsible for setting guidelines and standards. And you can see they're different from these guys, and they often don't communicate with each other. So the problem is really cumulative effects. The real challenge is these are all the different things which affect water, and often they're treated separately, like people deal with stormwater and some people deal with atmospheric pollution and some people deal with septic systems and some people deal with industrial discharge. But when you look at the watershed receives information and contamination from all of these, and we often don't address the cumulative effect. So the traditional issues have always been providing you with safe drinking water, trying to deal with wastewater and sewage, trying to look at stormwater management to minimize floods, usually dealing with water shortages, building lots of hydropower dams, fish management, agricultural use, and then allocating permits to use the water and looking at toxicity and regulations and pathogens in the water. However, we now have to deal with many more totally new issues. And for the first time in the last 10 years, we started to say, how much water should we actually leave in rivers to have good serving environmental processes? The new thing is also what are the cumulative effects and the interactions? What is climate change doing and how should we adapt? How do we protect the water sources? How do we actually protect wetlands and can we actually create wetlands? Because remember, wetlands are the best water storage systems, and they're also the best water purification systems. So we're now building wetlands in the middle of cities, in the middle of the city, to actually help with the pollution and the flood issues. Water accounting is something which is only starting, and conservation obviously is one of the ways which we have to start addressing all this climate change. Also, the new issues is water privatization and water markets. In many parts of the world, they're now putting water as a market commodity, and this has huge implications on the way we manage water. And then there's, of course, the virtual water, and the virtual water is the trade of water which you export in food, and we'll talk about this as well. And then there is, of course, the problem of desalination and long-term water storage. So these are the new issues which we have to address. And so the reason why we need to change the water governance is, in the past, we have focused on point source pollution. The points are usually a sewage treatment plant or an industry which releases water at a certain point in the river basin. But now we have to deal with these non-point source pollutions, which is individuals like you and me. We all contribute a small amount, but cumulatively that's a real problem. Excuse me. The other reason is the government structure is extremely complex and overlapping jurisdictions are widespread, so we need much better coordination and efficiency in how to improve decision making. We have very rapid technological changes, and the changes in regulation and accounting and permitting and monitoring and enforcement need to adapt these new technologies, because otherwise we won't be able to adapt as quickly as we can. And then, of course, there are all kinds of economic and public demand constraints, because the public demands usually exceed the capacity and the finances of governments to do what everybody would like to do. So integrated watershed management is a very popular concept, but is very difficult to implement. We have been talking about integrated watershed management for, I think, about 30 years, and few of these initiatives have actually been successful, because the top-down approach is preferred by governments because it's much more efficient, but it fails short in dealing with all these interactions. So the critique, there's been a lot of critique on integrated watershed management, is they say it's almost impossible to reconstruct the many government agencies that are responsible for water to work in an integrated way. They basically say it's unrealistic that the governments will change their habits. Water issues are usually too complex to be solved in an integrated manner, and there is a disconnect between the land use, governance, environmental factors, and human behavior. And most of the activities and their interactions are unpredictable. This is what the critiques, the people who criticize integrated water management mention. So why promote integrated watershed management? Well, we need to start thinking about the dynamics of water, because water is the most interesting material because it has a phase change. It completely changes on a continuous basis. And so there's continuous flux, and the rate of movement and storage is very difficult to understand. Water interacts with the geology, the soil, the plants, the atmosphere, and again, that creates all this complexity. The land use interactions change the water quality and the flow. It makes it difficult to deal with upland and lowland interactions. We remove, reallocate, and return water to the natural system when it is treated. And when we release that, we change the water quality in the environment. And how do we allocate water for people and the environment? So that's why it is so difficult. And Maria Cecilia will appreciate this. She took us up to this glacier. I go back 1 second. She all right, sorry. So she took us to this glacier in the Colombia a few years ago, and that was a real eye-opener to look at glaciers in a tropical environment. So we are talking about what footprints. We are now talking about a carbon footprint. We are talking about an ecological footprint, an electricity footprint, a water footprint. It's all about balances. Now, to do an ecological footprint is extraordinarily difficult. People have been trying to come up with ecological footprints, and it's a big challenge. The carbon footprint, which now everybody is talking about, is equally difficult. But the water footprint should actually be relatively easy to do in a watershed context. Similarly, the electricity footprint would be easier to do than these. So why are we, how do we use the watershed approach? Well, we delineate an area which receives precipitation, and then we measure what's going in and what's going out. So we can actually do a mass balance approach quite easily. And here's just an example of a watershed, and you can see all the different land uses in it. So we can actually measure what's coming out of it and measure what's going in. So an integrated water approach has to focus on the geographic part, the physical part. It has to involve partnerships with stakeholders, and it has to have management that is based on science. So this is the footprint on how we start integrated watershed management. So the real problem is when we deal with big river basins, it almost becomes impossible to manage a river basin because the headwaters might be several hundreds to 1,000 kilometers away, and what you do in the lowland is totally different what you do in the upland. And so we need to start thinking about scales. We need to start thinking about what you as an individual should be doing at the property scale or the farm scale or the business or industrial scale. And there you can actually look at water use efficiency, water demand management, waste control, different indoor-outdoor use. That is something which every individual can do at that scale. Then we have to deal with the neighborhood. And the neighborhood is usually a community, commercial or industrial complexes, cities, or farm communities, or so on. And there we need to start looking at land use interactions, competing demands for water, complex wastewater generation, infrastructure and treatment options, and water supplies and source protection. And then we need to move at the watershed scale, where we have to deal with all the interactions between the land use and climate and water. So when we deal with integrated watershed management, we can actually go from this scale to this scale to this scale and do a lot of positive things. So the advantages of using an integrated approach are as follows. The watershed is a natural system. It's very easy to monitor because you can measure what's going in, you can measure what's going out, you can model the mass balance, you're able to determine the cause and effect of what is happening. You can look at the integration of land use effects. When you monitor at the mouth of the watershed, you're actually monitoring the combined effect of all land use activities. And it allows you to look at the system as a whole. It also allows you to look at cumulative effects, air, soil, and water interactions, and it can also address diffuse sources like non-point sources. It's science-based decision-making, it's effective for management, and it enables you to do adaptations for all kinds of activities to prevent water shortages or water pollution. However, there are some real challenges which are difficult to address in a watershed context. Long-term monitoring in a watershed context is very expensive, and that's why some of the government agencies have been cutting back on the monitoring. And also, we need a lot of undisturbed sites to compare what the natural conditions are versus the impacted area. And as you probably know, there are very, very few areas now in the world where we have an undisturbed natural environment. Often, the governments collect important information on population and land use, but they collect it in jurisdictions which do not match the watershed. So, for example, if you want to know how many people live in a watershed, you have huge problems extrapolating information. The only place on Earth where they have changed the political boundaries to match the watershed boundaries is in New Zealand. So they actually changed the way they collect socioeconomic information. They do it on a watershed by watershed basis. And they even now gave the right to the river, which means if there is a legal case, a lawyer will have to defend the watershed against all the other lawyers who want to do that. So that's a very new, interesting concept. Extrapolating from one watershed to another watershed is actually quite difficult because every watershed is different. And if you look at where your water comes from, almost every water source from one city to another city is quite different. So we cannot generalize what we find in one watershed and just extrapolate that to another one. And then the processes change over time. Also, there's the scale issue of many of the processes are not linear, and upscaling and downscaling is very difficult. So most of the government agencies have been downscaling, and we're now suggesting we should upscale because it has to come from the citizen in participation in order to do that. And there's some issues which we have difficulties to address, like air pollution and climate change, because these things are global and we can't control that within our watershed. So if you have air pollution coming in from a neighboring area, well, we need to control that air pollution, not in the watershed, we need to control it elsewhere. So those are the complicating factors for watershed management. So we're now trying to form new structures of managing water, and we call them in many places watershed councils. So that's a new formation of a government partnership organization. And the goal is to provide much better communication and better collaboration between individuals and organizations. We develop an integrated strategy to address water issues. We reduce duplications. We want to make information available to the public in a very timely and user-friendly manner. We want to improve data collection and evaluation. We want to identify knowledge gaps and lack of compliance and emerging issues. And we want to focus on actions to resolve the problems and aim at protecting measures and rehabilitating all those things which we have done to deteriorate water management. So the constraints are often these new councils don't have sufficient financial support, because remember, government agencies are very protective of their territory and they often don't want to share financial resources. It's difficult to change government structures, policies, legal systems, and decision making. The constraint is fragmentation of responsibility. The governments don't want to give up some of the regulations and give the regulations and powers to the citizens. It's also difficult to reach consensus in a time-consuming manner when you have a stakeholder process. We have been participating in multi-stakeholder processes for the last 15 to 20 years, and yes, they're very good to learn about your system, but they take an enormous amount of time in an open democracy, and we don't really have that much time, so we need to speed up these multi-stakeholder processes. Depends on good leadership. If you have a council where you have really good leadership and good collaboration between participants, it actually works quite well. And how can we actually simplify the complex layers of decision-making and reallocating the decision-making process? And we need to find a balance between development, protection, and conservation. So these are the emerging issues. We have more extreme events like the one which happened last week in my part of the world. We have far too many water extraction permits for rivers and groundwater everywhere in the world. We have declining minimum stream flow. So when you look at the summer period when it's really dry, that minimum flow is declining almost everywhere because we tend to extract too much water from most of the rivers. And because it's getting warmer, we're going to have more evaporation, and that means more water is going to be in the atmospheric cycle. In some places, we'll have more water coming into our watershed because the glaciers are actually melting very fast. So everybody's happy we have lots of water. But this is short term because there will come a time when the glacier's footprint will no longer show. And right now, the emerging problem, particularly in the snow-dominated mountain areas, we're having a seasonal shift where the snow is melting earlier in the season, and that means we have less water during the dry season, and this is when the water demand is the highest. And so we need to increase demand. We should actually decrease the demand for blue water and increase our management of green water, and I will show you that in a minute. And expansion of water storage is happening right now because all of a sudden we want more electricity because the whole world is trying to move away from fossil fuel, which means we once again want to build lots of reservoirs and dams in watersheds and river basins. Also, we have very new water quality issues, and this is just showing you what we try to address in terms of water quality over time. So in the early days, we were mostly concerned about metals, then eutrophication. During the period of the atomic bomb, everybody was concerned about radioactive isotopes, then nitrate and phosphates, then we had acid rain, then we had organics and pesticide issues, endocrine disrupting substances, pharmaceuticals. Now it's plastic, and This year, it's the virus. So you can see we have all kinds of new water problems emerging, which we need to address, and we often don't have a lot of knowledge on how to do this. This is particularly interesting now with the coronavirus. We've never measured the coronavirus in drinking water and in river water, and now they're actually using sewage to determine how frequent the virus is in the city. So again, this is a real challenge to address emerging contaminants. So the main challenge for water management is how can we assure that everybody has access and gets equitable, address the equitable issues. All of these things have to interact, and that means it's a complex problem. So this is what we promote now in order to do an integrated watershed management approach. We say we should first identify the issues and the objectives using all stakeholder involvement processes. So the individual citizens need to be part of identifying the issues and the objectives. Now remember, people who live in the mountains probably have a far better understanding of what's happening in their rivers than the people in the capital city who run the government and make all the decisions. So this is an important step. Then we need to collect and analyze the available data, and this involves researchers and government agencies. Once we have all the data, we have to synthesize it, and then we can start saying, how do we address all these issues by developing a plan? And then we need to say, who is going to be responsible to act on the plan and makes the decisions? And then we can act and implement, and then we need to monitor that this is continuing. So that's the framework which we use to start an integrated watershed management approach. So the objectives usually are, what are the issues, what are the problems, what is the magnitude of the problem, what are the short-term and long-term complexities. And then for the data, we need all kinds of biophysical information, but also land use information. We need statistics and traditional information on what the laws and regulations are. And then the synthesis involves the environment, economics, community, eco-health, and all that. And then the planning can develop scenarios, options, including public participation in what the options should be. And then the decision making can be direct or indirect using a combination of people and even using non-monetary values, because how do you determine the value of environmental services? This is probably the most difficult thing for the economists to address. And then how do we implement all these actions, and how do we monitor, and how do we set standards and enforcement? So that's basically all the background. So that's very boring, but we need to follow that process. So now let's start looking at the water cycle. So most of the water is in the ocean. A lot of it is cycled in the atmosphere, and then it gets back into the land, and then it runs off back into the ocean. Have you ever considered how much water lands on the land surface of the Earth every year, and then flows into rivers, lakes, and so on, and eventually flows into the ocean? So how much rainfall, how much of the annual water from rainfall ends up in the ocean every year? Do you want to give a guess? So think of precipitation on an annual basis on the land surface, the total amount, and then measure how much ends up in the ocean. It is about a third. So about a third of all the water which comes down on the land surface actually ends up in the ocean every year. The rest is all recycled in the atmospheric cycle system. So you probably all know the hydrological cycle. You know water is coming in from precipitation, it goes into rivers, it picks up by vegetation, and so on. Well, I divide the water cycle into a blue cycle and into a green cycle. And the blue cycle is simply the precipitation which lands on the land surface, flows into rivers and lakes, and seeps into groundwater. That's what we call the blue cycle. This is the water which we use for almost everything we do. But the green cycle is actually very different. This is the precipitation which lands at the land surface, is intercepted by the vegetation or stored in the soil, and that gets picked up by the vegetation and evapotranspires back into the atmosphere. That is the green cycle. We don't manage the green cycle very well. We manage the blue cycle reasonably well. So how much of the water cycles through the blue cycle, which we use, and how much travels through the green cycle by the vegetation and soil? You want to give a guess? Nobody wants to stick their neck out, right? So all the precipitation which lands on the land surface, about 2/3 go into the green cycle, which means the vegetation and the soil will recycle it back into the atmosphere. It never goes into rivers or lakes or into the ocean. So 2/3 of all the precipitation goes into green cycle, and only 1/3 goes into the blue cycle, which is domestic use, industrial use, agricultural use for irrigation, and when we get gray water and recycle it, and then goes back into the atmosphere. So we need to start thinking about how do we address this green cycle, because only about 20% of all the land which is used for food production is irrigated, and 80% of the land which is used for food production, which produces about 60% of all the food, is actually going through the green cycle. And we don't manage this very well. We grow all kinds of crops like cotton in a semi-arid environment, like in Kazakhstan, which is a dry area, or Tajikistan, where which is one of the most water-intensive crops. So we need to start thinking about these things. I skipped that. So they have forecasted now the global water demand for 2030. And this is what they thought the global water balance is. So the green is what is used for agriculture, this is what is used for urban industry, and this is for domestic. And now the projections are we're going to have increases of 50, 80, and 40% in demand for water. So we're really looking at a real challenge. And I just finished teaching one of my graduate course, my last graduate course, and I had 40 students from 12 different countries, and I gave them an assignment, and the assignment was as follows. Pick a city in the developing world, look at the current population, and look at the population projections for 2050. Look at how much water they're using now and extrapolate how much water they would need, business as usual. And then come up with some scenarios of conservation. And then look at how much water do they have now and how much water would they have with climate change by 2050. So I had the opportunity to read 40 evaluations of 40 cities in the world. And it was very depressing reading because only about 2 cities actually had enough water resources, given the projections, to actually meet the demand, even with nature conservation efforts. So keep that in mind because people are still moving into cities, although there is a new movement back into the mountains as a result of the coronavirus. So Daniel Vivioli did a very interesting study many years ago. And what he did, he looked at all the major river basin and he said, how much of the river basin is in mountains? So the bars which you see here is the percentage of the river basin which is in mountains. And the dots up here is how much of the water in this river basin originates in the mountains. So these rivers here have about 95, almost 100% of all the water in these rivers or produce all the water resources for the lowland from the mountains. Some of them are a little less and some of them are very lowland kind of systems. But you can see in almost all cases, the contribution to the lowland is mainly from the mountains.
Excuse me, Hans.
Yep.
Do you mind if we stop now for the question and answer break? Or if you want to finish some
give me
concepts.
2 more minutes and I'll have a good way. Yeah. So this is a picture of the precipitation in the European Alps, and our Italian friends are all down here, and you can see the precipitation is the highest, the blue, in the mountains. And here is the Po Delta, which is quite dry and not much precipitation. So you can see most of the precipitation occurs in the mountains. And so there are 4 rivers which drain the European Alps. There's the Rhine, the Danube, the Po, and the Rhone. One that goes into France, that goes into Germany and Holland, and this goes into Austria, and this goes into the Italian Ocean, or the Mediterranean Ocean. And this is the alpine area. So it's 15, 23, 35, and 10%, a very small area of the river basin. But the contribution, the alpine contribution of the water is a third, 40, 50, quite a large amount. What is even more important is this. The annual contribution is high, but it is the summer contribution which is the greatest. So the mountains actually produce water at the critical time of the year when everybody needs water because the demand is higher. So this is really the most important thing to think about when we talk about water supply from mountains. And here is a table showing you all these big river basins from the Ganges, the Nile, the Yellow, the Indus, and so on. The amount of people in these basins, the percent of the area in the mountains, the percent of the water that originates from the mountains, and the extreme discharge. This is the highest discharge, the lowest, and the mean discharge. So that gives you a bit of an idea how important the mountains are for water. And now is a good time to take a break. About 5 or 10 minutes.
Okay, if you agree, we can submit one question for you that is in the chat. Then if somebody is interested to ask you some questions for 10 minutes, then we will have a 5-minute break and then we go back to the lecture. Is it okay for you?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so the first question from Danut is, can the water that comes from the mountains and is bottled be considered a mountain product?
Well, this is a very tough question because that means we're commercializing water. We're making it a marketing product. And water should be a common resource. So I have a little bit of problems marketing water. I give you one example. Chile has a water market. So if you want to buy a water license, you can buy it, and the highest bidder will get the water rights. This is creating huge problems for the indigenous communities in the mountains because mining companies have lots of financial resources, so they buy up the water licenses because they pay the highest price. And local indigenous communities don't have those resources. So marketing water and putting a price on water is a very dangerous and tricky kind of situation.
Okay. Another question from Piyush. I wanted to confirm that you are suggesting a shift from integrated water resource management to watershed management.
Can you say that again? I didn't.
Okay, I wanted to confirm that you are suggesting a shift from integrated water resource management to watershed management.
Well, it's the scaling problem. Like the sheep farm obviously is a scale issue. You know, we can manage all the integrated processes at the farm level in a very benign manner, and then we can actually prevent all the problems as we scale up. So the idea behind it is, if we want to have real actions, every individual who has a property or a house or whatever, he and she can do a lot to actually minimize the impact. And if we scale this up, I think that's the way to actually go. So I'm talking about bottom-up approach rather than top-down approach.
Okay, any other questions? I think no. I guess that maybe some of them will rise in your mind during these. Oh, there is a comment from Siyuti, taking example from Uttarakhand in India. Integrating water resource management has helped in generating awareness and data, but spring management has been more effective.
Well, we have a few success stories. We don't have a lot of success stories, but the idea behind it is we have not put enough effort into promoting some of these success stories. We always focus on the negative parts, and we should actually highlight, you know, the news media is always prepared to criticize and show all the problems in the world. What we really need to start doing is showing some of these success stories where things have actually happened. And it's happening at the small watershed scale. We now have hundreds of community-driven water management groups who are actually doing all these actions. And so I would encourage you, and I will show you later on tomorrow, citizen science and how we can do this.
Okay, many thanks. There is another comment from Piyush. Would you also want to reflect on interbasin transfers?
On the what?
Interbasin transfers.
Oh, interbasin transfer. Yeah, this is a really tough, a very, very tough question, because, and I will show you on the case study of the Colorado River, they're having 34 interbasin transfers. And Yes, I can see the problem. The Indus is a classic example where there's lots of interbasin transfers. And the problem there is when you transfer water from one basin into the other, you're changing the ecology and the environmental services quite dramatically. And yes, we often have no option that we have to transfer water out, but in terms of looking at an integrated approach and to maintain sustainability, we need to start looking at how much water can we actually extract out of the river basin or out of the watershed without the diminishing all the environmental services. So interbasin transfer is a very tricky situation. The worst case is in China, where they do almost everywhere is interbasin transfer. They're now finishing this huge interbasin transfer from the Yangtze River into the Yellow River. And that has huge implications because it changes the whole ecosystem balance within the watershed. So as the demand for water goes up, we'll probably have to address more interbasin transfer, but we need to be very careful how we do that.
Okay, thank you. There is a question from Barkataki. First of all, thanks for your elaborated presentation. Then the focus of the question is on groundwater recharge, and she wondered how it would be in case of mountains. So can you please put some lights on the relative groundwater recharge in plains versus in hills?
Yeah, this is a very important question because we have neglected the groundwater situation in many, many parts of the world. And the most difficult part is the interactions between groundwater and surface water, because groundwater is very hard to find and to determine, and groundwater is usually very old. Most of the groundwater is tens to 100 years old and has been accumulating during conditions where the climate was different. And so this is a particularly important thing in mountains because we now know that some of the fish, for example, our salmon in our river basins in the mountains, they rely almost exclusively on groundwater input into the river because that is cold water in the summer. When they come back and lay their eggs, they need cold water because it's a cold water fish. So as it gets hotter, they wouldn't survive. So almost all the spawning areas for some of the fish are areas in the river where groundwater is coming in and keeps the water cool. So the groundwater part is really important, but unless you have lots of drilled groundwater wells, you really don't know how big your aquifer is and how much water is there and how old it is. And you also need to monitor how much are we using and how much is being recharged. And the amount which is being recharged depends on whether it's a confined or an unconfined aquifer. So this is a very challenging kind of proposition, but it's very important. So we have focused almost exclusively on looking at groundwater as an entity and surface water as an entity, and we very few times looked at how they interact. And this is a topic which is important because almost everywhere you go, we are using more groundwater than is being recharged. You look at the Ganges River, there's obviously many areas there where the water table has dropped. In the prairies in the United States, the water table is dropping. California had 2 droughts, and I'll show you that later. Their water tables have dropped dramatically. So that's a very important area where we need to pay much more attention. And they have mostly been neglected in the mountains because most of the groundwater resources are being tapped in the lowland.
Okay, thank you, Hans. There is the last question before the break from Godfrey. He thanks you for the presentation, first of all. He agrees with the bottom-up approach, but there should be there should be political will from the policy actors for it to be effective. What are your thoughts about this?
Well, yeah, well, that's the big complicated question. How can we persuade the government to give up their jurisdiction and look at a more integrated approach where citizens' voices and needs are addressed in a better manner? So it means we need good leadership at the political level and an open-minded approach, particularly now with the climate issues, because as we'll see in the next presentation, the climate issues are coming far faster than what we have ever considered. Everybody is thinking, well, the climate is changing on a regular basis and it will continue. It is not. The climate is looking at peak and unusual events rather than a continuous change. And that's interrupting the whole ecosystem. And I will show you that in the next presentation because that's a really critical thing to do. But before we go to the break, I want to show you one quick thing. If you let me, give me 2 minutes.
Absolutely.
I just wanted to show you how variable water is in the mountains. This is the Himalayan range. This is the annual precipitation in the Himalayan range. If you go down here in Cherrapunchi, it's 11 meters per year. If you go up to Leh, it's 100 millimeters. That's in the same mountain range. It gives you an idea how variable these things are. If you now look at the maximum 24-hour rainfall intensity, down here you get 900 millimeters in one day. This is almost the amount of water we get per year. If you go up here in Leh, you get about 39 millimeters. That shows you the range of variability in a mountain range. So you cannot simply extrapolate from this watershed to this watershed. And if you look at when do you get the water, this is the percentage of the annual rainfall which occurs during 4 months of the monsoon season. So about 80% of all the water occurs over a very short period of time. And then the rest of the year you have no water. So the variability in mountains is incredibly complex. And that's not just in the Himalayas. This is what happens to the Ganges River during the monsoon when everything is flooded, and happens during the dry season. Or if you go to Peru, you can see that Lima, which is on the coast, gets about 10 millimeters per year. That's nothing. And then if you go up into the Amazon in Peru, you get 1900 to 2000, 3000 millimeters. So the variability in mountains in water supply is enormous. And so I want you to look at this last slide. So this is the traditional approach which we have used, and this is the innovative approach which we should use. And so I've left this up for those of you who want to look at it in more detail. This is what we have been doing, and this is what we should be doing. So now we can go for a break.
Okay, thank you very much, Hans. I've read that there are other questions, so be patient. We will answer to this other set of questions in the next 15-minute breaks. Otherwise, we will go out of time and it will be a problem because in this kind of online course it would be an issue to manage so much questions. So thank you very much. Thank you, Hans. See you in 5 minutes. Okay, welcome again, Hans. Welcome again, all the participants. And I hope the break was successful and you gain additional energy to attend the rest of the course. So please, Hans.
Okay, so this next section is on climate change, and I think we have made a bit of a mistake by telling everybody that the average temperature are important. So if you look at the CO2 emissions, everybody thought because of the coronavirus, the levels have decreased, but there is no evidence that the levels have decreased at all. And so we're really looking at a continuous growth of CO2, which means climate change is going to be critical. I showed you this before. Remember the green and the blue water cycle. So we have now said we want to keep the temperatures, the average temperatures at 1.5 to 2 degrees. So globally, between 1880 and now, the global temperatures have increased by about 1 degree. So it looks like, 1.5 and 2 degrees is something we can achieve. However, if you look at the mountains, this is the latest information from Switzerland. The average temperature above 1500 meters in 2020, so since 1864, has actually increased by about 2.37 degrees. So in the mountains, the average temperature has already passed the 1.5 and the 2 degree temperature mark. If you now go to the very high mountains, you will see I took here the Sentis Mountain at 2,500 meters. That temperature has actually increased 2.5 degrees on average. Now remember, we have a bit of a problem because most of the climate stations are at less than 500 meters. Only 17 are above 3,500 meters, according to the World Meteorological Society. And so mountains are actually warming up far faster than the lowland. And here is the evidence. So the global mean change has been 1 degree. The Northern Hemisphere has increased by 1.3. Canada is by 1.7. British Columbia 1.9. And the Swiss Alps 2.3, the high mountains 2.5, and the Arctic 2.3. So in the mountains, we're already way above what we're targeting by the Paris Agreement. Canada now has the reputation of the country which is warming up the fastest. So in 2016, Environment Canada have shown that the annual increases in Canada have been 1.3 degrees average, the winter 2.3 degree increases, so more warming in the winter than in the summer. And if you then look at British Columbia, which is in the mountains, you can see that our increases have been about 1.9 degrees, and the winter temperatures have increased even more dramatically, 3.7 degrees. When it comes to precipitation, we don't know what is going on. Some of the projections are it's increasing, and some of the projections say it's decreasing. I am at the opinion that I don't think we can predict precipitation changes in the mountains because there's too much spatial variability to actually do that. I showed you these records before, just wanted you to be aware. These average temperatures don't mean very much because it's the extremes which we are worried about. Remember, when do you worry about water? You worry about it when it's too hot or too cold, or when it's too wet or too dry. It's the variability and not the average which is important. So just to show you this event which happened last week, here is a 100-year climate record of the town which had the highest temperature. So the highest temperature ever was about 1939 at 44 degrees. Well, last week, the temperature record increased by more than 5 degrees. This is not just, if you look at the Olympics and the record on the 100 meters, people beat that record maybe by 0.1 of a second. We're talking about massive changes of 5 degrees. Here is some of the differences in the previous records. So 3 degrees, 4 degrees, 5 degrees. So we have had huge changes. In fact, Herrera is, excuse me, Herrera keeps a record on all the climate records around the world every year, and I just put up those records which were above 45 degrees at 17, 18, 19, and 20, and you can see almost everywhere in the world we have been beating records on a continuous basis. So it's the extremes which are worrying about. So I'll show you actually what is happening in our mountain areas as an example on what's going on. Here's the Columbia River Basin. It's a huge river basin. Only 15% of that basin is in Canada. The rest goes into the ocean here. The rest is in the US. That 15% produces about 40% of all the water in the basin. So 15% of the area producing 40% of the water because it's all in the mountains and has lots of glaciers. The population in this part is very small, 150 people, typical mountain communities, 20 communities with less than 20,000. Economic activities, forestry, mining, and hydropower. That's about it, and recreation. So what I did here is I looked at 10 climate stations which had a 100-year record. So all of these towns had 100-year temperature records. And then I looked at 18 river basins which are adjacent, or watersheds, which are adjacent to these different communities. And I looked at the interactions between the climate and the discharge of the rivers. So here is where all the river basins which I looked at are. So I worked with Alan Hamlet in the university when he was at the University of Washington, and he did an interesting experiment. He used 10 of the global models, the Australian, the Canadian, the American, the European. All these models predict what is happening in the future. And their predictions are warmer temperatures, uncertain precipitation in mountains, earlier snow melt, accelerated glacial melt, rain and snow events, changes in stream flow, and greater climatic variability. So he modeled the Columbia Basin watershed with all these models, and this is the result he obtained for temperature. So if you look at all these models, this is the data we have, this is the model data, and you can see all of the models are showing us an increase, but there is, of course, variability of about 4 degrees. But all of them are going the same direction. And then he looked at the precipitation. And some of these models are predicting a 25% increase in precipitation or a 20% decrease in precipitation for the same area. This means almost a 50% uncertainty. And that means models are not able to predict precipitation in these mountain areas, and we're going to have to live with the variability and uncertainty, which is really difficult for government agencies to address. What is most important is the fact that the minimum temperatures are increasing faster than the maximum temperatures. So I'm showing you now in January, February, and March, this is the extreme monthly minimum temperatures, this is the extreme monthly maximum temperatures, and this is the mean. So if you look at the changes, not much has changed in the maximum temperatures, is in the minimum temperatures, which is increasing. That is important because once the minimum temperatures get above 0, then we're going to have to deal with snowmelt and so on. So if you look at this, this is a good example in January the minimum temperatures have increased fastest. So when we look at this in this Columbia Basin from November till October, over a 1-year period, the greatest temperature increases have occurred in January and February. And these are higher increases than in the summer. And that means if the temperature is warming up faster, that means we're going to have less snow, we're going to have more rain, and that is going to change the whole way the rivers respond. So I looked at what happened to the 10 communities which had the climate records, and I put up when did we exceed the highest temperature records over on a monthly basis over the historic 100-year record. And if you look at this, you can see that almost every month from February, March, April, May, June, July, August, November, almost in every case, we exceeded the temperature records in the last 10 years. And that's for 10 different communities. If you then look at what happened last week, you can see even in these mountain areas, we got 40 degrees records in these mountain areas and high 39 or 38 degrees. This is in a mountain environment. This is not Karachi and is not Saudi Arabia. This is mountain environment. The variability is really what we have to worry about, and I don't need to show you the data. You can see in March and April, look at how the variability in precipitation has increased in our area. Dramatic changes. We still get very low precipitation, but look at the fluctuation. So it's the variability which we have to worry about. So again, this shows you a good example over a 100-year period what has happened to the precipitation between April and August, and you can see the variability is increasing dramatically. So here's an example of what happened when we use a 100-year record. The highest precipitation event in June was in 1963 at this level. In 2005, 2012, and 2013, we had 3 events which produced somewhere like 30 to 70% more precipitation than ever before. And when that kind of things happened, that's what you get in the mountain community, massive flooding. So the variability is really the key, not the average temperatures. So some watersheds in some areas, the precipitation is increasing, and in some places it is decreasing. And in some places, the summer precipitation is not changing, or the summer precipitation is increasing, or some really strange things are happening. This is showing you an example of when you look at linear trends. You can see in the 30s, when it was very dry, we got low precipitation, and then all of a sudden we went to a shift change where the variability in precipitation was much higher, and now all of a sudden we're getting a drop. And this is happening in the whole region in our part, and this is an interesting phenomenon because in the summer precipitation, all of a sudden we had a shift change from very high levels to much lower levels. You can see this is 100 millimeters, 200 millimeters, and 160 millimeters. So we're in a totally new phase. This is a step change, and I have a partial explanation for this step change. We had major El Nino effect in 1999, and that apparently shifted the ocean pattern, which is resulting into a step change. And this is bad news because this is the summer precipitation, and it has declined by about 20%. So if you then look at the highest precipitation record, because it's so much uncertainty, again, you can see most of these records were broken in the last 10 years. How about what happens to the rivers? So here's a good example on how extreme these situations are. So this is the temperature range, and this is the precipitation. So in this diagram, if you're up here, it is cold and wet. If you're down here, it's hot and dry. So this is the monthly record for June over 100 years. So all of these points are 1-year event in terms of temperatures and precipitation. In 2015, we were at the high temperature end. In 2012, we were at the wet and low temperature range. So you can see we have had extreme events in the last 10-15 years, which are unprecedented when you look at the long-term record. This means depending on whether your watershed is rain dominated, snow dominated, or glacial dominated, you get a very different picture. So here is a watershed in this basin which is increasing. Here is one which is decreasing. Here is not changing. And here is another one which is not changing. This is the discharge of the river. So every river is responding differently. And you're going to have to remember when you deal with watersheds, don't generalize, look at your watershed as an individual. So just as an example, how do we go from snow to rain? So this is the winter precipitation and the discharge. So the blue is the precipitation and the red is the discharge. So the precipitation in the winter in this particular watershed has declined, but the discharge in the river has actually increased. So how do you explain this? How do you explain that we get less precipitation, but we get more discharge? And this is not glacial fed. So the snow accumulation is declining, but the rain is actually increasing. And so we're getting a shift from snow to rain, and that makes a huge difference in the way the water behaves. So here's an example in April where this is clearly shown. So in April, we still have lots of snow. So we're in 2016, we had a very dry and hot condition in these two stations. And then when you look at the river discharge, because it was so hot, we got record discharges because the snow was melting very fast because it was very hot. If you now look at 2015 and 2012, look at how these rivers responded. 2015 was a hot and dry, and the 2012 was a wet and cold condition. That's in June, when the snow has melted, and we got in 2012 a huge rainfall event, and it created a massive discharge in the river. And then a few years later, in 2015, we had this dry situation. So we're going from one extreme to the other extreme in very few years. So this is a classic example, which I could show you several river basins where this has happened. So when you look at the monthly discharge in all of these rivers, you can see that we had record discharges almost in every month of the year, except maybe in August and maybe December and January, all in the last 10 years. See that these are the records over 50 years, which all of them are in the last 10 years. So glaciers are important, and we know they're shrinking. If you look at this situation, you can see that we're probably by 2050, we won't have very many glaciers. And as I mentioned to you, glaciers produce cold water in the summer when it's mostly needed. So this is the glacier in the tropics, which we looked at. What is particularly interesting in this case is this is located near volcanoes, and the volcanoes often produce some volcanic ash. And when that volcanic ash gets deposited on the glaciers, it is dark and it absorbs more heat. And this is accelerating the melting of the glacier. So we project that these glaciers are probably going to disappear in the next 10 years or so. And if you look at the glacial melt in a typical river basin, usually the snow melt is earlier in June, and then the glacial melt produces more water in the stream in August when the demand is the highest. And so what will happen is in these rivers, the red line is the future when the glaciers have shrunk small enough that they no longer contribute a lot of water in the summer. So the maximum temperatures have increased and the precipitation has decreased, and that means we can show that even in glacial-fed streams, we're now no longer getting this summer contribution from the glaciers because this particular glacier has shrunk to the point where we don't see this summer peak. So that gets me to the Glacier National Park in the United States, which is a park which was created in 1910. It's the only national park where they have glaciers. Van Fagre, my colleague, did a study where he looked at when the park was created, they had 125 glaciers. In 2010, he made a similar inventory and they had 25. Here is the amount of visitors which come into the park every year. So the total visitors over a 100-year period has been about 100 million, and you can see the more and more visitors are coming to visit this park. So the advertisement for this park now is, please come and visit our park before the glaciers melt. And they are now expecting that probably by 2030, they won't have any glaciers left, and they will probably need to change the name of the park. Their advertisement now is, come and visit a dying glacier. That's pretty crazy what all these things are doing. So for those of you who live in the Himalayas, you probably know all of this. These are what we call the glacial lake outburst floods. So if you have a main glacier which comes through here, and then you have a tributary glacier which comes through here, the tributary glacier is smaller, so it melts faster, so it often creates a lake. And this is still frozen. But as the temperatures increase, this starts to melt, and then all of a sudden we get these glacial outburst floods. This is one event which we experienced when we worked there. And you can see here is the reservoir and here is after the burst. And then you can see the legacy of this kind of an event. This is before the burst and this is after the burst. So now we have so much sediment in this system that it will take 10, 20, 30 years for this sediment to actually move all the way down to the Ganges plain. So these events can have catastrophic impacts on not only the livelihood, but also on the entire aquatic ecosystem. Here is a very good example to show you how the variability is increasing dramatically. What I'm showing you here are all the dots of the hydrometric stations in the United States. So these are all the measurements of river discharge. The black and the blue are rivers which in May 2011 were at a flood, an extreme flood stage. So all of these were flooding. All the red and the yellow are river basin measurements where they were in an extreme drought. If you look at this, This is extreme drought, this is extreme flood. So here's the Mississippi River Basin, and in this time of the year, they got the headwaters in complete flood and the mouth in complete drought. So it's very rare that you will be working in a river basin where both a flood and a drought occurs at the same time. Usually it's one or the other. And of course, this changes as the water then comes down in about 3 to 4 weeks' time and will probably create less drought than before. But that gives you a bit of an idea how the variability is actually increasing. So there's no doubt about drought. And you need to remember that droughts can be very different depending on whether it's a meteorological drought or, sorry, I went too fast. Well, of course, I'll just stay here. So the drought processes are the climatic factors, but there is also a land factor and there is an impact factor. So you have to start looking at temperatures, wind, humidity, and precipitation. So if the temperatures are high, precipitation is low, you've got lots of wind and low humidity, you obviously are going to get evapotranspiration, you get much less runoff, the surface conditions change, the soil conditions change, and the superficial material change. And so we get water deficits, and then we get vegetation stress, we get low stream flow, and we get soil crusting. All of this has huge impacts on the way we manage the water. So this is the situation right now, June 15th in the United States. This is the extent of the drought. And what they do in this drought monitoring system, they classify the droughts into an abnormal drought, a moderate drought, a severe drought, an extreme drought, and an exceptional drought. So the very dark and red colors are extreme and exceptional drought, which only occur once every decade or so. So this is the process of what has happened in this part of the world this year. So that was in November last year. This is what the drought situation was. In February, it reached this kind of level, and in June, it reached this kind of level. So we're increasing the drought dramatically over a very short time period. This is just showing you what has happened over the last 20 years. This is 2000, and this is 2000 right now. And if you look at, we had droughts here, look at the dark and the red. These are the extreme and exceptional droughts. We are now at the highest drought level ever since 2000 in this particular western part of the United States. And of course, that creates all kinds of forest fires. And if you look at the forest fires over since about 1980, you can see the amount of hectares which were affected by forest fires in the United States. You can see in the last 10 years, we have exceeded anything which had happened in the previous year because it's getting drier and we get higher temperatures, which not only stresses the trees, but we also created a lot of monocultures in the forestry where the species are even aged, they're not diverse. We had massive increases in diseases because of climate change. We had a lot of air pollution which stressed the trees. We had increasing fuel loads because we didn't manage the trees, and we have more access roads, which means less careful people smoking pot and everything else, which creates fires. So forest fires have increased dramatically, particularly in British Columbia. So 64% of the land area in BC is forest cover. We have 60 million hectares of forests, And you can see from this graph here how much in 2017 and 2018, how much area was affected by fires. And the calculation by the researchers have now shown that during these 2 years, the CO2 emission was higher from the forest fires than from all the human activities in our province. So when we do our carbon budget and when we start calculating how much we should reduce our emissions, we need to start including forest fires as a source of water, of pollution. The climate change is particularly important because
कति बेला खाने खाना सकिन्छ अब ब्रेक हुन्छ अब ब्रेक हुन्छ एकछिनमा अब 5-10 मिनट पछि
well, I'm sorry, I didn't know what you asked for.
I guess he forgot to close the microphone.
Yeah. Yeah, there you go.
Okay. Okay, no problem.
No, go ahead.
Go ahead, sorry.
No problem. So we have always pine beetle infestation, but the pine beetle infestation was fluctuating because when you get a very cold winter, they die back, and then when it's warm again, they come back. So in 2019, we had temperatures starting to increase and we had no longer cold winters. And so the pine beetles just exploded. And between 1999 and 2014, 18 million hectares of forests were infected by pine beetles. Now imagine what that means. So we now have all these dead trees. And so the dilemma was, what should we do? We want to prevent fires. We need to harvest all these dead trees. Otherwise, if a lightning strike hits, we have massive fires. And so the government said, okay, let's start harvesting, but we weren't able to harvest fast enough because then all of a sudden it exploded. And so that's the reason why we had these massive fires, and it's still part of the problem we're facing now. Just to give you an idea what these fires do and what the drought does, what I'm showing you here is California had a drought in 2014 and 15. Usually, California produces 18% of the electricity during from hydropower. So 18% of all the electricity is produced from hydropower. They had a drought, so the blue is showing you how much electricity they produced in 2000 to 2011. And then they had the 2014 drought in yellow, and this is the reduction in hydropower produced because of the drought. And then in 2015, it decreased even further. So they had to replace the electricity demand by using natural gas. And this cost them $2 billion to meet the demand for electricity. So you can now see the potential problems when you start thinking about hydropower and electricity and drought. So when it comes to drought and floods, we can actually predict floods quite well. We know when they probably start. We know, predict probably the size of the flood. And the timing is a little difficult, but we can give people at least a day or 2 days or 3 days notice when, based on the rainfall, the snow cover and all that. And then we can give people advance notice. When it comes to drought, this is far more difficult because we never know when the drought starts. We never know how long it will last or what the size of it is. And that depends on all kinds of climate factors. And we usually get little advance notice when to start adapting and how to respond to a slow progress of drought. So this is a very important thing to consider. So both of them are problematic for us, but droughts are more critical because we have problems predicting it. So the possible reason for change in river discharge over time is we have massive changes in precipitation, temperatures, and groundwater. We have also massive changes in land use. And so when we look at river discharge, it's not just the climate. It is all that, so the climate is important, but it's the vegetation changes, the land use changes, the impervious surfaces, and the soil conditions, which really affect the runoff. And so the factors that are important for the runoff of major mountain rivers is changing precipitation, changing in snow accumulation, changes in glacial melt, changes in the management of dams and reservoirs, domestic water extractions and other water extractions, changes in vegetation cover, overuse of groundwater, and soil compaction and soil surface cover. So those are the factors which we need to consider. And the main problem is look at variability, not at averages, because it's the variability which creates all the problems. It's when it's too hot, too cold, too wet, or too dry. And this stresses the ecosystem far more than when you have a gradual increase in temperature or precipitation. So when you look at an aquatic organism, when you get these peak flows or these drought conditions, this is when everything is stressed. And this is the same thing for human behavior. If you now look at our situation, we had this hot period, everybody got stressed because of the heat, or you get stressed when it's too cold, or you get stressed when it's too wet or too dry. So think of variability in mountains, which is far greater than in the lowland, and make sure you address these when we start adapting. So it's time for a break because you're totally exhausted, and I'm happy to answer a few questions before we break.
Hey, Hans, thank you very much. Okay, so we start again from the long list of questions for you. So the first one is from Gujan. In which category, green or blue water, do fossil water like groundwater and glacier belong to?
Yeah, well, we have green water, blue water, white water, gray water, and black water. And we need to start thinking about how we deal with these different types of water. So you know the blue and the green is what the blue which we use, the green is what the vegetation uses, and then is this gray water. The gray water is the water which is slightly polluted, but can be used for certain purposes. The black water is sewage, which cannot be used directly, it has to be treated. And the white water is the water which evaporates. That we can't manage very well. So we now are at the stage now where we have used most of the blue water, and we're trying to address the green water to be more efficient in the water use. And then we need to start recycling the gray water. And this is particularly important in the communities and in cities because we can actually irrigate with gray water in many cases. We can flush toilets with gray water. We don't need to treat the water to very high quality to flush your toilet. So the gray water use is a really important kind of area where we can do all kinds of new things and be more efficient. In fact, I have a rain barrel, 2 rain barrels. I collect my roof water and I use it for outdoor purposes. That is gray water use. And that saves a huge amount of domestic water which has been treated and is expensive.
Okay, thank you, Hans. There's a question from Kundan. Due to the lack of sustainable use of natural resources, we are losing many watersheds. What will you advise for the overall development of the watershed management in mountain region by involving community residing there?
Yes, in fact, this is the reason why we have this initiative of community-based watershed management councils. And if the communities live in the watershed, they have a responsibility and a conviction that they want to maintain their watershed. So we need to promote, and particularly from the political end, we need to promote and finance these different organizations because they can actually do far more than what governments can do. And remember, I'm going to talk to you later on tomorrow about citizens' involvement in all of this and what they can do using all the new technology.
Okay, thank you. I try to summarize the questions in order to save time. From Pranab, what about artificial groundwater recharge in mountain?
Yeah, this is a very tricky question because remember, the only way we know where the groundwater is and how much of is available from groundwater is when we drill wells. So if you only have 1 or 2 wells, you can't really do very much in terms of determining how much water is actually available. And the main problem is because you are in a geologically complex environment, it is very difficult to actually determine where the best groundwater aquifers are. And as I mentioned before, groundwater is actually not the most recent water. It is usually, in some places, 1,000 to 2,000 years ago and was collected at conditions when the climate was different. So what we need to do is if we have a groundwater aquifer, we need to start monitoring that aquifer to see whether the water balance is maintained. And the way we do this is simply monitor every year the fluctuation of the water table, because in the summer the water table goes down because people use that water. In the winter when it rains it comes back up. So there's always this fluctuation every year. In order to see that your groundwater table is actually being exhausted, you need at least 5 to 10 years of record to see whether this fluctuation from winter to summer is actually declining. And so California had no groundwater regulation. They had a big drought, and during a drought, everybody goes to groundwater. So then all of a sudden, the groundwater table was dropping dramatically and the land subsided. So roads were buckling and bridges were collapsing. And so they finally decided they would initiate groundwater regulations. So they're going to look at how much water is there and how much water are they using and is it declining. And so they enacted this 2 years ago. How long do you think before they can actually enact this regulation? It's going to take at least 10 years before they can actually do that, because they have no records of how large the watershed is, the aquifer is. They have no idea how many people are using that water because they've never made an inventory on the wells. They don't know because nobody has been measuring how much water they're extracting, and they need at least 10 years of data before they can actually show you whether the water table is actually dropping on a continuous basis. So this is a very challenging thing, but whenever there's a drought, this is the last resource for water, and this is very, very important to address.
Okay, thank you. A question from Anu. if variability, especially the extremes, are the new normal, does that mean that we have entered a new climate regime? If yes, what does this mean for development thinking and approach in the mountain? Is this what we mean by we need innovative approach?
Yes, I totally agree. It's the extreme we have to worry about, and I don't think we can stop the extremes. All we can do is start thinking about how best to adapt to these conditions. So if we have major floods, we can do all kinds of innovative things to protect communities from increasing floods using a combination of engineering and natural processes. We're now at the point where we say all these innovations should mimic natural processes. So we still need the engineers and the infrastructure, but we should do them in a much more benign manner, which uses the natural processes. And so this is important in terms of adaptation. And this is very important in the mountains as well, because the mountain areas have greater variability than most of the lowland areas, except in those areas where you get hurricanes.
Okay, thank you so much. Question from Claudia. I was wondering if there exists a watershed council for the Columbia River Basin that includes US and Canada representatives.
Well, we have been having a lot of discussions across the border, and we have 15 community groups in the Canadian part, which are managing the water in each of these watersheds, and they're doing extremely well. They're doing all the monitoring. I'll show you some of the wonderful things they're doing. And we have discussions with our neighbors, and we're now actually renegotiating the water treaty between Canada and the United States on how to manage this river basin. This is a very unique river basin in that we had an agreement between the two countries on how to share the water. And it's the only international agreement where the downstream people are compensating the upstream people for storing water so that they can reduce it, use it for hydropower production. It was created in 1964, and it is being renegotiated after 60 years because the treaty was 60 years. And it's a very interesting example of when the treaty was signed, the only issue was flooding and hydropower. And now we're renegotiating the treaty, and now it is so much more complex because we have climate change, we have endangered species, we have all the problems with electricity demands, we have climate change. All these issues were not addressed when they initiated the treaty. So this is just starting, and we have about 2 more years to renegotiate this. So there's a lot of interactions going on, but you might want to look at the treaty because it is a good example of how to share water in an international context.
Okay, thank you. There are the last couple of questions that I can summarize in a unique one. It's concerning forest fire. First of all, how much do they affect global environment? And then, do they cause drying of springs?
Well, if you look at the Amazon, you can see the problem with forest fires. And what is particularly interesting, you need to think about this, is in our part of the world where we have very few people in the mountains and the forest, about 50% of the fires are lightning strikes. They are made basically natural events, and 50% are human induced. When you go to the Amazon, it's almost 100% human induced because the Amazon is very wet and you wouldn't get very many fires. So this is a global problem, not just in British Columbia. You look at Australia, they have had the worst forest fires in the last 2 years. You look at the Amazon, you look at Russia, northern Russia had huge forest fires last year. So this is a combination of climate change, impacts on the vegetation due to drying and pollution and everything else. And because it gets warmer, we have more diseases, which means it stresses the trees, which means the risk of forest fires is increasing. And so we need to manage these forests in a much more rigorous way. And Giuseppe can give you far better information about this because he's the expert on forestry and how to manage forests for fires.
Okay, thank you so much. Now it's time for another break. We are perfect in time, so we can manage 10 minutes break before the next session. So see you in 10 minutes.
So I want to show you a case study of a river basin which right now is in dire stress as a result of climate change. And this is a good lesson to learn for all of the other river basins in the world. So I mentioned to you the Colorado River has about 47% of the river basin in mountains, but generates about almost 100% of all the water in the mountains. So here is the river basin. It goes through all these states. Here are all the mountains, and here is the lowland. So the river basin is very large. It has an elevation range from 4,250 meters to 0. It goes into the ocean in Mexico. And it serves about 35 million people for their water. 85% is used for agriculture and 15% is used for urban and industrial stuff. It's a snow-dominated watershed where about 80 to 90% of the supply is from snow in the mountains. So the mountains have about 1,000 millimeters of precipitation per year. The mean of the river basin is 350, and the lower basin down here only gets about 5 millimeters, which means it's a very dry area in the lowland. So the mountain temperature, of course, are very low in the winter time, particularly. This is the average. And in the lower basin, the summer temperatures on average are 32, and now they're even much higher than that. So the natural river discharge in the middle of the watershed is about 18 kilometer cubes per year, and from 1900 to about 1950. But since the last 10 years, from 2000 and 2010, it has dropped dramatically to about 14 cubic kilometers per year. So what are the key facts of this river basin? The peak discharge is between April and June. That's when the snow melts. The mean runoff is 35 millimeters per year. The average snow accumulation is 75 to 85% of the stream flow, so mostly stream dominated. The upper basin, it's estimated that about almost a quarter of the winter precipitation is actually sublimated. It's not actually creating runoff. And the evaporation in the lower basin, because it's so hot, is estimated to be about 1 kilometer cube. 1 million kilometer, 1 kilometer cube, sorry. So the upper basin, the estimated return flow from groundwater in the mountains is about 40%. So 40% of the water in the river is actually groundwater. So they built a number of reservoirs, and I'll show these in a bit. So the upper basin has only about 1.2 million people. The lower basin has 10 million people. And there are 34 in the basin transfer which serves somewhere between 25 and 30 million people. The upper basin is mostly forestry, recreation, and livestock agriculture. The lower basin is more diverse, still has a lot of livestock production, lots of crop production, lots of recreation, lots of hydropower, and a lot of urban water demand. So very different situations in population and water demand. They built two major reservoirs that make Lake Mead and Lake Powell. The Lake Mead was built in the 1930s and the Powell was in the 60s. Just to show you that these lakes store the water for all the people use, but they also generate a lot of electricity. So in the case of the upper one, they have a capacity of about 1,300 megawatts, and the lower one has about 2,400 megawatts. There are about 100 storage dams in this river, but these two rivers contribute about 80% of all the water storage and all the electricity which is produced in this part. So Lake Powell, they measure the lake level every day, and the highest lake level was in 1983. That's the upper lake, and the lowest lake level was in 2015, and the current rate is here on June the 5th, but I will show you that this current rate has actually dropped from June the 5th to now. In the lower part, the highest level was 373 meters. The lowest level was 326, and you can see we're almost close to the lowest level ever. And so they produce about 65% of in-stream uses for hydropower, and this is the amount which they can actually produce. So what is particularly interesting is when they first built the dam, they had 15 years of climate data in the 1930s. And this turns out to be now the wettest period ever. So when you look at after Lake Powell was built in the 60s, 70s, you can see the water table is actually increasing, decreasing, and increasing and decreasing, but there is a clear trend of the water table of the lake declining in the upper reservoir as well as in the lower reservoir. So in the 80s, if you look at here and here, there was actually quite a lot of water, but since the 1980s, look at how things have changed. So they had a number of many droughts in this river basin. They had a drought before they built the dam, another one here, another one there, another one here, another one here, another one here. And right now, they're in a long-term drought since about 2013. So during this particular drought, this is how much runoff on the river they got. And this is the average, which they usually get, is about 18.2 kilometer cubes of water per year. And during this drought, it was 15. And to this second drought, it was even less. So now think of this in a very interesting way. So this is June 15th, the drought I mentioned to you already. But now let's look at November 10th, February 9th, and June 15th. So that's 1 month ago. And so I showed you this, but this is the newest. So since 2000, we had the extreme or the exceptional drought in these dark colors in 2003, which means the area in the basin was 6% in an exceptional drought and 27% in an extreme or exceptional drought. In 2015, they were 15% and 6 slightly less than it was here. Today, and this is the latest, which goes to June, let me see, June 29th, that's a week ago. Look at what has happened. There now 16% of the river basin is in an extraordinary and exceptional drought. And a third of all the river basin now is in these extreme and exceptional drought category. So this is, in the history of this river basin, the greatest drought. Maybe not the paleo droughts, which we don't know much about, but anyway. So in 2010, we had a very high level of discharge in the river, but since that time, the discharge in the river has been much, much lower than the mean over the entire time period before the drought. So whenever there's a drought, the outflow exceeds the inflow. So the 2001 drought, you can see the outflow exceeded the inflow because people need more water. So on an annual runoff basis, before the dam was constructed, the average was about 20, and then the average since that is 18. But during the drought, this is dropping by about 19% lower than the average over the whole time period. And you can see what is happening to the reservoir. So when they decided to use this water, they allocated the use of that water equally. They said the upper basin is allowed 9 kilometer cubes per year, and the lower basin 9 kilometer per cube. They did not consider lake evaporation, which is about 1 kilometer cube per year. And remember, this amount of water was based during the wettest period in this record. So they thought, we have no problem, we can actually use that much water, and they gave permits for people to use this. So if you look since about 2000, the supply is in blue and the use is in red. So we have exceeded the use over the supply almost every year since 2000. The latest, June 23, this is the lower reservoir. So right now in blue is the water level dropping at a rate which is faster than almost all of the other 5 years for which they have data. And it's continuing. So they are projecting a decrease between now and 2050 of anywhere between 5 and 20%. So 80 to 85% of the water is used for agriculture, 15 to 20% is used for urban water use, and there is very small amounts of industrial development. And as I've mentioned, they allocated each the same amount of water, and Mexico was allocated about 1.8 kilometers for their use at the bottom of the basin. So there is 6.7 cubic kilometers of water is actually transferred out of the basin on 37 different interbasin transfer. So 78% is surface water, 22% is groundwater. So let's look at the population. So in the upper basin, we had 7 million people in 1990, the lower basin about 23, and look at what has happened in 2020. Both areas have increased in population, but the upper basin has actually increased more, but the amount of population, about 35 million, live in the lower part and the transfer. And what is particularly interesting is the area in the lower basin has very nice winters. So a lot of people retire, they want to go to a place where things are very nice during the winter, where they can play golf and so on and so on. So one of the reasons why the population in the lower basin has increased dramatically is a lot of people retire in an area which has very nice winters. However, since it's getting very hot, they're now at the situation where it is getting too hot in the summer, which means they have to cool themselves with air conditioning, which means they need far more water. And also, it's now at a point where a lot of the people move out during the summer because it's getting too hot. And so this is an interesting phenomenon where before everybody was moving into the area, and now as a result of climate change and as a result of the coronavirus, people are actually moving away during the hot period. So what have they done in terms of trying to address this problem for the urban water use? As I mentioned, 15% or so is used for urban and industrial purposes, which means the water supply for the urban population for 11 million within the basin and 25 million interbasin transfer. So the average use in 2000 per person for the urban use was 685 liters per person per day. And they started to realize they had to start conservation measures, and they were reasonably successful in 2018 to reduce this to this, which means simple conservation, they were able to save about 1 kilometer cube of water per year for reducing the stress on the system. However, this is still a very high level compared to some of the European countries where the average demand for domestic water is about 150 to 250 liters. So it's still double from what we could actually achieve. So there's still room to improve the water use by conservation measures. The other problem, which is particularly dramatic in the lower basin, there's an estimated 600 types of golf courses, because when the people retire in these rich countries, they want to play golf. And golf is a terrible thing for water because they use somewhere between 350 to 700 cubic meters of water per day. This is huge and is far greater than anything we use on a per person basin for domestic purposes. And if you think golf courses are only a problem here, we now have all kinds of golf courses. There is actually a competition on who has the highest elevation golf course in the world, and people want to go and play golf on top of the mountains. In Switzerland, they even had a demonstration golf competition on the top of the glaciers a few years ago to promote tourism in the Alps, where they were playing golf or demonstration golf on the glacier. So there is room to address this drought at the domestic level if we consider more conservation measures domestic part. So how can they do this? Well, we know that about 24% of water is used in the domestic system by toilet flushing. And I calculated the average person goes about 7 times a day. And if you have a conventional toilet with 21 liters flush, you probably flush about 150 liters per day. If you go to these low flush systems of 3 and 5 liters, you can actually save about 100 liters per day. So there's huge possibilities to actually reduce the water consumption by toilets. And as I mentioned before, using gray water to flush toilets is another option. Showers can be reduced, faucets can be changed, washing machines can be changed. So there are all kinds of options to reduce the water supply or the water use for all these different domestic purposes. So these are the things which we can do. However, here is the agriculture, and agriculture uses about 85% of all the water. It's about 85% in the upper basin for livestock production and about 39% for livestock production in the lower land. So it's estimated there are almost 1 million cattle and sheep populations in the upper watershed and about 1.5 million in the lower watershed. And this is the amount of water these animals need. And compare that to the population, the human population is about 35 million. So we've got about over 2.5 million cattle and sheep need which need to be irrigated, and they also consume water. So about 85% of the crops and the feed production is irrigated. And the major crops in the lowland is alfalfa, cotton, maize, wheat, and vegetables. And the interbasin transfer crops are almonds, vineyards, rice, fruit, and vegetables. So what does that mean in terms of agriculture? I'm putting up the amount of water that is needed for the growing season for all of these different crops. So if you look at wheat and onions and potatoes and beans, they are relatively low water demanding crops. But the alfalfa, citrus, Sudan grass, rice, almonds are in a very high range. And remember, almost 39% of all the crops grown is for livestock feed, particularly for alfalfa. And alfalfa is the most water consumptive crops, using about 29% of all the water of the crops being used. So how are they going to try to address this water shortage for agriculture? So they're now saying they should shift the crops which they're using from water-intensive crops to water-efficient crops. So they're now proposing for the farmers to change growing alfalfa into sorghum, because alfalfa takes far more water than sorghum and can save, if they transfer all of this, they can actually save a lot of water. More important is cotton, which shouldn't be grown there anyway because it's a very dry environment. Again, if they would switch from this to this, it would actually save them another huge amounts of water. So this is now being discussed, and they're now encouraging the farmers to actually switch crops. But this is a real difficult process because it requires massive changes for the farmers to change the equipment, the labor. It affects the economics, and it affects the risk, because often they don't have a lot of experience for these different crops which they have never grown. And the reason why they used alfalfa was because it's a nitrogen fixing crop, so you don't need to fertilize as much. It's a very good feed for dairy cows, and it's very easy to grow, is somewhat drought tolerant, but it has very high water use. So this is now being contemplated as one of the options to address this really critical water shortage in this river basin. The next thing they're looking at is irrigation efficiency. Almost 3/4 of the area which is irrigated is flood irrigated, and you can see the efficiency of flood irrigation. Only about 60 to 75% of the water applied by flood irrigation is actually useful, the rest evaporates. So they have to start thinking of going from flood irrigation to either sprinkler or, in places where they can, to drip irrigation. And this is the type of irrigation they do in the lowland. This picture is actually from Jordan, but I didn't have a good picture. So this is called the central pivot irrigation system, where they have an arm circles around, and it is so efficient now with the technology that they can apply water in the most efficient way depending on the soil conditions, and they can vary the amount of water which is being applied depending on the day, the crop, and the variability. So the options are there, but it's expensive. So so because of this drought now, the real problem is we need to start saving water. And the options for all this is deficit irrigation. In other words, using less water. This is happening now in rice production anywhere in the mountains of the world. If you go to Bhutan or China or Nepal, the rice production now has looked at deficit irrigation where they can produce the same yield with much less water. We can improve the irrigation technology. We can start looking at following some of these areas. The problem is when you have a drought and you have a crop, well, you can lose that crop for the year, and next year you can grow a new crop. If you have orchards like almonds, well, if you got a drought, you still have to irrigate those crops or those trees because they won't survive. And if they don't survive, it will take you 5 to 10 years before you're back in business. So it's important to think about, if you have orchards and drought conditions, how much water do you want to allocate, and maybe you should change orchards. Shifting and switching crops is a very interesting options they're considering now. They're actually now working on groundwater banking. What that means is in wet years, they try to recharge excess water to recharge the aquifer so that they can use it during a drought period. They call this groundwater banking. Also, they now have to start buying back the water licenses. You know, when they allocated all these water licenses, they are forever. So if you own the water license, you can use that amount of water forever. And now the government says, well, we need to buy back some of these licenses so that we have enough flow for environmental services in the river. The other thing which is very important is they now have to consider maybe exporting or producing less food for export to save water. California, in the lower part, produces 60% of all almonds being produced in the world. And almonds are the most water-intensive crop. It's also one of the most profitable crop, and most of it is exported. So as we get to water shortages, they might want to stop exporting as much almonds to save water. And now they're also considering desalination for drinking water. You cannot do desalination for agriculture because it's too energy intensive, because agriculture uses far more water than domestic people. And so desalination is only basically possible for domestic purposes. So there is a trade-off for all of these options, but this is what they are considering doing. So the drought is now affecting hydropower at a dramatic rate. During the drought in 2013, you can see that the capacity dropped from 2,800 to this, and in 2014 this. So demand for electricity is increasing rapidly due to very high temperatures which require air conditioning. So when the current temperatures get up to 40 to 48 degrees, you cannot no longer function unless you can cool yourself. And those of you who live in Delhi or in Karachi, you know this problem. If you don't have air conditioning, it's almost impossible to do the basic tasks. So given the climate variability and the changes, these are some dramatic things which they have to consider. So the projected climate changes over the next 30 to 40 years is the snow accumulation will decrease by about a third. temperatures will increase somewhere in this range in the mountains, which means increasing winter temperatures, less snow, more rain, shorter snow season and earlier snowmelt, earlier peak spring runoff and less summer flow, more storm flow variability in winter, less base flow in the summer, less groundwater contribution, decreasing soil moisture during long drought periods, increasing water demand, and more evapotranspiration and more frequent droughts. So they're saying for every 1 degree increase in temperatures in the mountains, they might have a decrease of 9% in the stream flow. So the imminent water crisis in the short term is they can reallocate water rights. They can go to massive water restrictions, which will affect agriculture and urban water use. And they will have to start really reconsidering the hydropower production. However, the long-term situation is much more dramatic because we need some real critical changes in agriculture in that river basin. They will have to start restricting the type of crops they use. They have to abandon some of the agricultural land because it will no longer be possible to produce all this. And then comes the change in population dynamics. Will there be out-migration from a too hot environment and the energy crisis? And what will actually happen to maintaining environmental services in the stream? So the interesting thing now is we learned during the virus crisis that we can work remotely. And now there is actually a movement of people away from these areas to go to areas which are cooler. And just as an interesting concept, the companies who produce all the servers which help you with all your cell phones, these servers are huge industrial complexes which need to be cooled. They use massive amounts of energy to cool the computer systems. They're now moving some of these computer systems into mountains where it's colder so that they can save energy. And that means we might have people moving back into the mountains because they have to service some of these computer systems. So there is an opportunity, a twofold opportunity, which we need to think about is, will people actually move from all these cities into the mountain environments because of the climate conditions and because they can now work remotely? And this is food for thought for you to consider, because I know some of our colleagues like Michele and another colleague in the Prague Republic, they're actually teaching from the mountains. So time for questions.
Thank you, Hans. Okay, we have some questions now. First of all, from Piyush, could you please explain winter sublimation?
Winter submission?
Winter sublimation.
Oh, sublimation. Sorry. So when you have a snowfall, some of that snow, the moisture in that snow actually doesn't go into water. In the water phase, it goes directly into the evaporation phase. And this is a particular problem which I will address tomorrow when you make snow, because all these ski areas are now forced to make snow in order to have enough snow for skiing. And so if you then create artificial snow and you blow it into the air, a lot of that water which you use to make the snow volatilizes directly without going into the water phase, the liquid phase. Does that help?
Okay, thank you. Another question. We will move to the livestock topic. How sensible is the livestock industry to this water issue, and what measures are they taking to save water?
Almost all rice is irrigated by flood irrigation, and usually what they do is they fill the rice paddy completely with water, so the rice, particularly when you plant it, so the rice is always water saturated. So what they're now finding is they don't need to keep the water table in the paddy at the surface. They can actually keep the water table just below the surface, about 10-20 centimeters below the surface, which means you can actually reduce the amount of water which is evaporated. So this is called deficit irrigation, and apparently it saves about 20 to 30% of the water. The International Research Institute in Manila, which is the Rice Institute, IRRI, they have a whole program all over the world now where they are promoting much more efficient rice irrigation without having to go to very expensive irrigation systems.
Okay, thank you very much. From Claudia, the change in crops and irrigation technology implies a lot of changes for farmer livelihoods. What kind of support are the farmers receiving to implement these changes?
Well, this is a big challenge because farmers are generally reluctant to change unless they get incentives because they have a certain infrastructure, they have a certain equipment type, and if they switch crops, they might have to change this whole thing. So until very recently, there has been no incentive to do that. But because of the water crisis now and the climate emergency, people are starting to realize there needs to be subsidies. And so now some of government agencies are actually helping the farmers to convert from their traditional system to much more water efficient type of crops. And this is happening pretty much everywhere. And it's of real concern, not only for the countries which produce a lot of food, but it's also of concern of countries which import a lot of food. Because if you don't have a lot of water, you don't want to grow a lot of food because otherwise you don't have enough water for domestic purposes. So if you take the country of Jordan, which has the least amount of water, they import 4 times more water in food than they actually have available. If they would have to grow that food, they wouldn't have enough water for domestic purposes. So this whole virtual water trade is going to become very important. And this is a problem for the mountains because if mountains get dry, importing food is a little difficult. And so we need to start looking at what can we grow which is water efficient in dry mountain areas and maintain food production for local consumption rather than having to rely on imported food, which is water intensive and difficult to get into the mountains. It's another strategy to help alleviate the food poverty in many of the mountain regions.
Okay, many thanks. From Shalini, would like to know more about groundwater banking and where it is being implemented.
Okay, it's implemented now in the lower part of this California Basin. So what they do is they flood several fields which are above the groundwater aquifer. So when there is a real big rainfall, they divert the runoff from the river into the farmer's field and let that water very slowly infiltrate and recharge the aquifer. This can only be done in aquifers which are unconfined. What I mean by that is there are aquifers where the surface material above the aquifer is coarse, like sand and gravel and coarse textured soils. So the water can actually infiltrate and recharge the aquifer. There are other aquifers which are confined. Those are aquifers which have either rock formations or clay layers, which doesn't allow the water to penetrate through those layers. And that water gets recharged either from very different geological areas or might not be recharged at all because it's very ancient water which was created during glaciation and post-glaciation. So there's a huge difference between confined and unconfined aquifers. So aquifer banking can only be done in those aquifers where the surface layers are coarse textured sands and gravels, and that allows then to use that water during drought. And that can only be done during wet periods and not dry periods.
Okay, many thanks. There is a comment and the last question before a 5-minute break. First of all, the comment is from Joao, I guess, concerning the rice plantation and water saving. But those are the farmers and vegetable producers, not the livestock producers.
Well, you have to consider the following. Producing beef is the most water-intensive activity you can ever imagine. To produce a kilogram of beef takes about 15,000 liters of water to produce. That means you have to start looking at the feed which you produce and then the conversion and the use by the animals. So 15,000 liters of water per kilogram of beef. Most of the crops, rice uses about 2,000 liters. So compare 15,000 to 2,000. Vegetable crops are 5, 6, 700 liters per kilogram. So we need to start thinking about not only reducing or changing our diet from a meat-based diet to a vegetable-based diet, not only to save water, but many of these animals generate a huge amount of methane. So if you look at sheep and cattle, they burp about 17 times a day, and every time they burp, they excrete methane. So as an example, New Zealand has about 30 million sheep and about 10 million cattle. And they did a carbon balance, and they figured they were okay because they grow a lot of forests, and they figured the forests will decrease the CO2 emissions. And then they calculated the methane emissions from all the livestock, and I put whole carbon balance into the negative. So this is a big dilemma for the mountains, because a lot of the mountain people rely on livestock for their livelihood. But you need to start thinking about that balance in those mountain areas which are dry, because you might want to change the idea of using less meat, not only to save water, but also to save emissions. And there are opportunities to use different types of crops to get your proteins. If you look at quinoa, which is a grain crop, which has a very large number of proteins, which actually could be grown in other high mountain areas, which will be a very good alternative to all these beef and chicken and goat and sheep production, which is actually very water intensive and very bad for the environment. So I'm trying to convert you all from reducing the amount of meat which you eat to help the environment.
Okay, just the last question before the break from Gunjan. I was wondering if by any means the virtual water export is addressed in integrated water management.
The virtual water
is addressed in integrating watershed management.
Absolutely. I work in the driest watershed in Canada, the Okanagan Basin, and in that basin, it's the driest basin. It's the only place in Canada where you can grow peaches, apricots, and vines. And that watershed now has virtually used up all the water resources. And it's the only place where you get some reasonably nice winters, so a lot of people retire. So you got the problem of people moving in, and you got the problem of being able to produce crops which you can then export because they can't be grown anywhere else in the country. So they're now at a point where they say, we can't stop the population moving in, but agriculture can actually start thinking about using producing crops for domestic use or local use rather than exporting these, because this way you can actually save water. So if you produce a crop and then you export that crop, the water used for that crop cannot be used for anything else. So this is now being considered in watershed management plans, and in those areas you might want to consider importing food to save water.
Okay, thank you very much. Now there is time for a 5-minute break, and then we are back for the last session of the day. See you in 5 minutes.
Oops. Can you hear me?
Yes, please,
Yeah, okay.
go ahead.
Okay. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about hydropower, because this is going to be a real big thing. Because remember, everybody is talking now that we need to convert all our energy environment from fossil fuel and oil, gas and oil and coal into renewables. And of course, hydropower is a very useful way of generating electricity, because it usually creates very little greenhouse gas. So it's a low carbon, in the low carbon environment, you can see it is better than solar and has the advantage that you can actually bring up electricity on demand. When the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow, you can't produce electricity, but hydro can do that. So we have 3 different types of reservoirs or hydropower systems. One is the conventional reservoir storage system, one is the pump storage system, and one is the run-of-the-river hydro system. All of these 3 things usually occur in mountains. So the mountains are the hydropower headwaters of the electricity business in the world. So if you look at non-renewable electricity, about 73% of the non-renewable is from hydropower. So we now say that by 2050, we need to go from 0 renewable to 100% renewable. I'm not sure this is possible, but this is basically what people are proposing. So right now, 27% of all the renewables is from hydropower. So this is the percent of the electricity generated for renewables. So in 2020, the hydropower capacity was about 1,300 gigawatts, and we're suggesting that the hydropower capacity needs to be increased to about 2,600 gigawatts by 2050. That means right now we're growing hydropower at about 1 to 2%, and the projected growth is 2 to 4%, which means we will need more hydropower reservoirs and dams everywhere in the world, and that happens in the mountains. So if you look at the 1950s, this was the gigawatt capacity for hydropower, and it has increased slightly during the last few years. And now we're talking about the massive increase. So this is going to be a real challenge. And so the changes which has happened is the following. We had rapid hydropower development in the 60s to 80s and 90s, where most of the hydropower was developed in mountains in the developed world. And then hydropower dams had a very bad reputation, so there was a stagnation period. And now, since about 2005, there's been a massive increase, and the increase is particularly pronounced in China. So hydropower produces about 17% of the electrical capacity in the world, and it's 71% of the global renewable. It's flexible. Protected hydropower demand, as I said, is to anywhere from 1 to 4%. And by 2020, winter electricity demand has decreased and summer electricity demand has increased, mainly because people need to cool themselves more in order to survive. So this is a major shift. We've used more electricity in the winter in the past to keep our houses warm and everything else. And now we're actually switching because we need cooling, and cooling takes far more electricity than warming. So historically, this is when all the hydropower development took place. But now, in the last few years, you can see the increase has been dramatic. So by 1990, there were about 40,000 dams. And since 2090, we have built much more reservoirs because of watershed by cities, the need for green energy, and the concern about global warming. So the World Hydropower Association calls hydropower the battery for electricity for the world. So installed capacity has increased, and the global capacity now is greatest in China, which has huge implications for many of you who are working in the Himalayan range, because most of the rivers which they're using for hydropower actually leaving China and are affecting you in the other countries below. The most popular thing right now is pump storage. I don't know how many are familiar with pump storage, but the idea behind pump storage is you have two reservoirs. One is low and one is high, and the power station is somewhere below. And so what you do is you only operate when the demand is the highest. And then you pump the water from the higher reservoir into the lower reservoir, and you create the electricity. And then during the night between 1 o'clock a.m. and 4 o'clock a.m., when nobody uses electricity, they use excess electricity to pump the water from the lower reservoir back into the upper reservoir. So they can make far more money only operating during breakfast, lunch, and dinner time, because then the cost of electricity is much higher than during the day. And so when you look at pump storage, there's been a massive increase in popularity of hydropower generated by pump storage. In fact, Germany produces about almost half of the hydropower from pump storage, and here are some of the percentages of the hydropower generated by pump storage. And now this is a very popular proposition. But this has huge implications for river flow, because you're now recycling water up and down, and you release much less water than before. So the number of dams has changed quite a bit. Some of these dams are used for irrigation, some are used for hydropower, some are used for water supply, some are used for flood control, some are used for recreation, and some for other purposes. And many of them in the past have only been used for single purposes, and now we're starting to look at, can we use these different reservoirs and power systems for multiple purposes. So the advantages of pump storage is it operates only at peak electricity demand, which means you can actually make more money because the prices are much higher, and you can use other sources of electricity between 1 and 4 a.m. when the demand is low and the prices are low. So in Europe, what the Swiss and the Italians and the Austrians and the French are doing is, at night they import nuclear energy from France, which you cannot upgrade and downgrade. It's constant. So they use that energy to pump the water back up, and then they produce the electricity when the power is in high demand. So the disadvantage of this pump system is you're reducing the stream flow below the reservoir. It affects the hydrology and the ecological services. It inundates land or the two reservoirs, and it's hard on equipment and operation since it always works at peak capacity. This is like if you drive your car always at high speed, that's much more difficult on your engine than if you have a regular flow. Have you ever seen a traffic light like this? What does that indicate? It says you are warned not to stay in the riverbed. The hydroelectric power plant may cause a sudden flooding anytime, even in good weather. There have been a number of incidents in the European Alps where tourists were having a picnic in a river bed, and all of a sudden a real big burst of water came down and either destroyed their picnic or even affected their health. So they are putting up these signs because what is happening now, this is a picture of the Swiss Alps, and the colors of the rivers are telling you which one are flowing naturally in blue, which one are influenced by regular hydropower production, which is all the time, and which one they call peaking hydropower. This is when you just increase the flow and release water during very high demand periods. So you can see there are lots of rivers which are impacted by peak flow, and this has huge implications for safety of people and also for the ecosystem. So high seasonal precipitation and stream runoff regimes make this whole operation very difficult. And depending on a difference in the climate regime, you have to consider elevation aspect, topography, and so on, and a difference in upland lowland system interaction and water availability. So we need to start thinking about how do we cope with these wet and dry periods? How do we reduce the impacts of operating hydropower downstream? And how do we store more water for electricity production during annual and on-demand flow? This is just an example from Nepal, where we worked for a long time. This is what happens in the dry season. It's what's happening in the flood season, and you can see the problem if you have a regular stream system without a reservoir. So the reservoir can actually do a number of good things and a number of bad things. One of the real bad things is we always said when you build a reservoir, this is good for tourism. But if the reservoir is shallow during the summer when the demand for electricity is high, you end up with a situation like this, where you got very little water for recreation and a lot of windstorms which move around a lot of particles. So when you look at conventional hydropower systems, these are all the impacts which hydropower has on the water regime and the river basins. So we have hydrological effect, we have water quality effect, we change the river morphology, we impact the aquatic system, and we have local climatic effects. Some of these reservoirs actually moderate the climatic conditions. So these are all negative things, but there are also some positive things. Remember, reservoirs, if they're deep and in the mountains, the water is relatively cool. And now they have actually regulations in Europe that during the summer, they have to release water from the reservoirs even when they don't need it for hydropower in order to flush the river below, because when there's very little flow, the pollution concentration go up. So in order to maintain good environmental services, you need every so often to release some water to maintain environmental services. And that means in the summer, when you release water from the reservoir, it's cold water, which helps reduce some of these problems. So there are positive aspects and negative aspects. Usually the negative aspects are greater than the positive one. So as we shift from snow to rain, we are going to have peak flow earlier, and the winter accumulation of snow is clearly declining, and that means even the hydropower systems will have to play totally differently or operate totally differently as climate changes. So when you look at all the free-flowing rivers in the world, there are only about a third of all the rivers in Asia, about half in South America, 18% in North America, 35% in Africa, and 28% in Europe, which we consider free-flowing rivers. All others are impacted by reservoirs and all that kind of stuff. So if you look at the electricity demand for air conditioning, it is estimated right now that 1.6 billion people are using air conditioning. That's about 30% of the current electricity use. They project that by 2050, about 5.6 billion people will use air conditioning because of global warming. So, as an example, last week, we got these temperatures which were in the high 40s. Nobody in my part of the world has air conditioning, and people got really affected by the heat. So now people are actually buying air conditioning units in anticipation that we will have more of these different events. So when temperatures reach somewhere between 45 to 55 degrees, in order to function and to stay healthy, you need cooling, and this is a particular problem in many lowland cities. Not so much a problem in the mountains, but definitely in lowland cities. But remember, you are the hydropower paradise for the lowland people. So just to give you an idea, some of these temperatures in 2016, 17, 18, these are some of the cities which had over 50-degree temperatures, and these are the number of people which are affected by it. And if you look at the blood temperature is about 36 to 37 degrees, sauna temperatures are about 40 degrees. How long do you stay in a sauna? Probably 15, 20 minutes. So if it gets above 45 degrees, you're in trouble. So we will need much more energy for cooling, and hydropower is only part of the solution. I showed you this before. This is just showing you the impact of a drought on hydropower production going from January to December. This is when there is no drought, and this is at the peak of the drought. So obviously we have to be very careful when we rely only on hydropower for this kind of activity. Remember, in our part of the world, 95% of our electricity is hydro. So we're very much sensitive to floods and droughts. So claims by dam proponents have been that the environmental social impacts can be mitigated. You know, they always say when we build a new power dam, we remove people and land and we compensate them. But there's a problem with involuntary settlements. There's problems with fish passages and maintaining environmental services. So the claims really don't match up before that actually is happening. Large-scale projects are considered more economically efficient. Well, I would say small-scale projects are probably less destructive and are probably less expensive. There's lots of untapped potential sites, which they claim. Well, all the really good sites have already been used. So any of the new sites will be a little more problematic and more expensive. High urban demand, they have the capacity to pay for these dams, but the rural benefits are usually small because often the power and the destruction is in you don't get much power from the local reservoir, and the benefits going back to the people who live in the reservoir is usually low. And they all claim it's a reliable long-term revenue source, but it's high risk, and short lifetimes of reservoirs are common because many of these reservoirs are receiving lots of sediments, and usually when they build the reservoir, they give it a lifetime of 40, 50, or 60 years. We have lots of examples where this hasn't happened. So environmental services are critical because it provides water for people, food, and vegetation. It has a social, cultural impact. It has a regulatory impact, and it has a supporting function. So we need to make sure when we build these hydropower systems that we can maintain the providing and the supporting services provided by nature, and we need to regulate them, and we need to make sure that the cultural and social activities don't impede the environmental services. So the direct interventions to improve ecosystem services, we need regulations, we need economics, we need government initiatives, we need more technical information and more cultural information, because determining how much water we should leave in the river is extremely problematic, because we don't have very good measurements on what is a safe amount of water in the river to maintain our environmental services. And so these are the methods which we use to determine what a minimum flow or an environment flow should be. And each one of these methods is very difficult to conduct scientifically because there are all kinds of limitations associated with these systems. The conclusion by all the scientists now is that what we should be doing is not just looking at the minimum flow, but maintaining about 70 to 75% of all annual flow at any time of the month. So from January to December, we should maintain the river flow at about 70% of the natural flow. And in this case, it would mean that most of the environmental services could be maintained. So the problem with that is, of course, we've given a lot of people water licenses without sufficient knowledge how much water and base flow variability exists. Remember, we gave these allocations at the time when climate change was not very important. But now climate change is affecting the natural base flow, and that means we're going to have to start thinking about buying back water licenses for environmental services. So the solutions are using conservation measures, restricting water allocations during drought periods, a moratorium on allocating new water licenses. In other words, if new people want water access, we have to stop allowing them to do that, and we have to buy back licenses, and we have to start recycling and recharging water into the stream in order to maintain environmental services. So in conclusion for this morning, we have discussed all these climate impacts, and we have discussed the variability. And I want you to think about this very carefully, because remember, the Paris Agreement is 1.5 to 2 degree average temperatures should be maintained, and we need to reduce emissions to meet that standard. In my view, we're already exceeding that, and in my view, that's not that important. What is far more important is how do we adapt to these very unusual events of too hot and too cold and too wet and too dry. Those are the real issues, and we need to start finding methods to adapt to these new conditions, and there are all kinds of possibilities to do that, which we will actually talk about tomorrow. And by now you're probably totally exhausted, and we'll stop at this point for a few more questions, and then we let you go and relax and recuperate from all this overwhelming information.
Hans, thank you really very much for all these interesting presentation and data and ideas to think about. So we are going to the conclusion of this first session, but we have time for some more questions before one or two logistical announcements for the next day. And so please don't be shy. If you have some more questions, I would like to remember that Professor Schreier will be with us also tomorrow. So if you need to think about all the information he provided, maybe you can share your question for tomorrow. But if you have some queries now, they are welcome. So please.
I put up my last slide for this morning just to encourage you that there are all kinds of new ways in which we can actually address some of these things. In this case, floodwater management. That is what we have been doing traditionally, and that is what we actually should be doing. And so don't get depressed from all the negative things I've shown you, because we need your innovations and your enthusiasm to actually address these things. So if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them, and we'll go from there.
It's a matter of approach. I have a question or some curiosity concerning livestock and our change in diet, because we need to think about this. What about insect farming for future of our nutrition? What do you think about insect?
Well, there's a very interesting situation developing right now. Apparently, we're looking at all kinds of insects which can actually produce quite a lot of protein. The problem is the basic attitude of people is when you talk about insects and ants and stuff like that, they don't think that's very appealing. However, this is something we might start considering. Could we actually grow ants commercially for food production? Another interesting thing which is happening right now, bees are an incredibly important thing for pollination. If we want food production, we need bees to pollinate all of these different plants. And because of pesticide and because of all the changes in the natural flowering systems, we have had a tremendous reduction in bees. So now there's a huge effort everywhere to actually use bees, increase bees for pollination to the point where some of these beekeepers actually make more money by renting out their beehives for agriculture than making the honey. So what happens is if you have an orchard, you rent a beehive for a month or so during the pollination period. So the bees, they only travel about 1 kilometer in a spatial area. And so they're very important to pollinate your crops. So we now in the city have about 25 pollination areas where they have an open block, which a gas station has been abandoned and the place is empty. So the citizens have now created pollination areas in the city for bees, and they're growing all kinds of different flowers to help the pollination part. One of my former students actually has a business, and what she does is she has a number of beehives and she rents them out to neighboring people for their garden pollination. So if you have an apple orchard or a couple of apple trees or pear trees or whatever you have, she brings in her beehive for 3 weeks during the pollination period to increase pollination so we have more fruit. So that's another one which is not necessarily for eating directly the insects, but by looking at some of these opportunities for encouraging for more food production. And this can be easily done in the mountains where we grow a lot of orchards to help increase production.
Okay, thank you very much for this point. There are two questions. The first one is from Piyush. Earlier you mentioned about wetlands. Could you elaborate a bit more on how the attitudes toward wetlands is changing?
So wetlands have a very bad reputation because when you read all the British literature, because they have a lot of wetlands, the moors, all the British literature is negative about wetlands. They tell you that they have all kinds of bad spirits. They smell because there's hydrogen sulfide gas usually, which smells really bad, right? People have been drowning in wetlands, so they have a terrible reputation. Yet, wetlands are the best carbon storage system. It is the best water storage system, and it's the best water purification system which nature provides. The farmers have been removing wetlands in their fields because they don't like it, because they can't travel through it with their equipment. So we have lost about half of our wetlands, and remember, wetlands store the largest amount of carbon, and accumulate carbon and put it into long-term storage. So we're now starting to look at how can we enhance wetlands, and can we actually build constructed wetlands mimicking the wetlands which nature has generated. And so in our city, our students have been involved in about 10 different wetland creations in order to help stormwater management and to help reduce the pollution of the runoff from the surfaces of the city. And in the Columbia Basin now, some of these communities have been given financial support to enrich the already available wetlands, because some of them have been affected by climate change. So they're now looking at, can we divert a few more amounts of water from rivers into the wetlands so we can maintain it during the dry season. So I was involved in a small project in Honduras some years ago. Maria Cecilia probably knows this quite well, where in this village, all the sewage from the village went right into the stream. So we had a bunch of young people and we said, well, why don't we build a wetland just before that sewage reaches the river? And we only had a few days to do that. And we went up the river to find the right plants which survive on wetlands. And lo and behold, this helped improve the water quality in the river a little bit. And a few years later, apparently the young people built several more of those things. So we now have enough knowledge on how to create artificial wetlands by using the knowledge of how natural systems work. So wetlands are a very, very important thing to do, and they're actually quite good for the biodiversity and for aquatic organisms, and they're also a wonderful place for birds.
Okay, thank you very much. We have 2 more questions, and then we have to stop. Really, there are 4 questions, but I try to summarize because the first 3 are concerning dams and hydropower and their interaction with floods, ecosystem, and social conflicts.
Okay, so remember, a lot of the hydropower dams were built to control floods. That's one of the things which reservoirs actually can do. They can actually, if they're depending on the season and the year and the situation, they can actually store the water and then release it slowly. So they serve a very good function, and then of course they can produce electricity. But remain, everything we do has a positive and a negative impact, and all we can do is kind of balance these things out. So if you look at the Himalayas, some of these major floods, if you have a good reservoir, it can actually reduce some flood effects. However, we have to be extremely carefully, because if we get some very unusual new events, like, this incredible height dome situation, or if we get a flood which magnitude is far higher than we have ever experienced, we have to make sure that the infrastructure actually can be maintained. Because if the infrastructure isn't good enough, you can create even more problems. And this is a really interesting thing, because as you get older like me, you deteriorate. Well, as the dams get older, they also deteriorate. So we need to start looking at the old dams, which were built 30, 40 years ago, to totally different standards from the new standards. And we're now in a process of actually removing some of these dams because they're no longer safe for these new climatic conditions. So that's one thing you need to consider.
Okay, thank you very much. The last question is from Ghulam Mohammad. In recent years, the Glacier Lake outburst flood started very fastly in Pakistan. What are the main causes?
Well, the main causes are simply permafrost melting. This is a topic which has not been given a lot of attention, and Danilo is a much better expert to talk about this than me. What is happening is when it's cold enough, the moisture in the rocks freezes, and then that the ice will hold the formation together. And as it warms up, the surface starts melting, and then as it melts, the water can actually become liquefied, and then the structure is becoming more fragile. This is a particular problem for mountain climbers now, because in the past they were climbing in the summer and it was still frozen, so the rock was fairly good intact. But now as it warms, it becomes much more fragile, so they have a much more rock fall. And Danilo, you might be able to give them a much better answers than me on this.
Sorry, Hans, we missed the last sentence. Sorry, I guess some connection issue.
Oh,
sorry.
Well, not a problem. I was saying you might be in a much better situation to answer that question because you're the expert in all of this stuff. I was saying that the mountain climbers have been impacted by this quite dramatically because as it gets warmer, the ice which holds the rock formation together melts, and then you get all kinds of rock falls, which affects all kinds of people which do mountain climbing. But there's much more to it, and Danilo can actually address this.
Okay, so if Ghulam is interested, I would be happy to discuss with him maybe by email. So we want to steal time now for your lecture. So first of all, I would like to thank you very much, Professor Schreier, for this very interesting first day of IPROMO course. See you tomorrow at the same time with the same link to the virtual class. You will be advised for any changes in the link. Now I invite everybody to open the microphones and to clap your hands to thank Professor Schreier, and see you tomorrow. So please open your microphone and webcam and give big thanks to Professor Schreier.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you so much, Professor.
So much, Professor.
So much.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you so much, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you. Interesting presentation.
Hans. It was a pleasure to hear you.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you.
Thank
Have
you.
a,
Bye for now. Professor. Okay.
have a day for the rest of the year. See you tomorrow.
Thank you. Bye.
Professor.
Thank you very much, everybody. See you tomorrow.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
See you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.